So thank you once again and welcome to this session 48. It's entitled Cryogovernance II. And I'm honoured and excited to be co-hosting this session of the International IVF Initiative. For the videos of the previous sessions, please go to ivfmeeting.com. You'll also find information about the upcoming sessions on the same page. It's so much better than Netflix. Our continued goal is to provide educational opportunities while bringing our community together. It's great to see so many reproductive biologists and specialists connecting with each other from across the world to participate in these great sessions. Thanks for logging in and listening, and please do ask questions. And it would be wonderful if you could rate this session and actually any other sessions that you might have attended and provide reviews, as these can really help the speakers and future audiences. The way to do this is go to the IVF Meeting website, and actually I believe there are going to be some spot prizes awarded for the best presentations and reviews. I'd like to remind you that everyone will receive a certificate of attendance within about a week of each session. My name is Alison Campbell, and I will be co-moderating this session with one of the most talented reproductive scientists I know, genuinely, and that's Dr. Rita Vilela. Dr. Vilela is the scientific director of the Eugene Group, and in this position, she is responsible to set and implement the research agenda for the group, with the support of the R&D teams in 9 countries between Europe and the Americas. She also directly supervises the group basic research hub located in Barcelona. I must go and visit that if I may. Trained as a vet and a scientist in Italy, Canada and the US, she has more than 20 years of research and management experience in reproduction, with more than 100 publications in international journals and book chapters. Her main research interests are pre-implantation embryo development and human ART policy. Rita was a member of the executive committee of ESHRE for 4 years, and now she's an associate professor in translational medicine education at the University of Barcelona. And she's very proudly co-director of the master's degree in human assisted reproduction technology at Pompeu Fabra University.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alison. Well, actually, I have to say I'm in fantastic company, and it is really my pleasure to be here as a co-moderator together with you for this really exciting session on cryogovernance for the next hour and a half, more or less. It is really remarkable how successful this international IVF initiative has been, and how many scientists and embryologists have benefited from education and interaction that it has offered. But let me tell you guys, if you don't know, a little bit about Dr. Campbell. Dr. Campbell is based in the UK, and she's super famous. She has played really a key role in establishing and improving IVF laboratory for now over 25 years. She's the director of embryology for the CARE fertility group, and in that position, in that capacity, she heads the 13 laboratory teams, which means more than 100 embryologists, both in the UK and Ireland. Her strategic role in this position involves driving standards, best practices, and also leading R&D across all these sites. She's a member of the Alpha Scientist Executive Board. She's a fellow of the Royal College of Pathologists and a director of the CARE Fertility Group. As you can imagine, she was responsible for the first clinical application of time-lapse microscopy in the UK, and this was almost a decade ago. And since then, she has published quite a lot in this very interesting area of assisted reproduction. She has a passion for training and development of embryologists. As you can see from her background, she has just recently established a state-of-the-art, fantastic training facility at CARE Fertility in Manchester. If you want to know more about the moderators, but the speakers especially, all the biographies are available in the session panel on the ivfmeeting.com website. So we have a very committed and talented support team that are working behind the scenes. And so we will endeavor to post your question to the speaker, and we will do it partially live, but also by tapping answers. And for this, is it really important that you ask questions using the Q&A button and not the chat function. Otherwise, we will miss them. So as I said, we will discuss some of these live and some will be typed back to you in that session.
Great, thanks Rita. Now let's get started with our first speaker. I'm very pleased to be introducing Matt Pettit and his quirky lecture title, which is Sunk Without a Trace, Launching an Electronic Cryo-Management System Shouldn't Be a Titanic Challenge. And this lecture is kindly sponsored by IMT Matcha. Matt Pettit is Head of Innovation and Product Specialist at IMT International. He's responsible for the provision of cryopreservation systems to animal breeding programs and for the development of implementation of Matcha, which is an electronic witnessing and quality management system for IVF clinics and donor banks. Matt graduated in biology from the University of Wales and worked in R&D specialising in bovine and equine sperm processing, cryopreservation and semen evaluation techniques. He's since set up a stallion semen freezing unit and managed R&D in a bovine sperm sexing facility, Cogent. It was the first company in the world to be issued a license to sex sperm by flow cytometry. Matt joined IMT International in 2005, and he plays an integral role in production, product development and sales and marketing. Matt is an expert in quality and risk management in IVF laboratories and an advisor on the Good Automated Manufacturing Practice framework for system validation. So it's really nice to see you, Matt, and I'd like to hand over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alison, and also to Rita for moderating what promises to be an informative and stimulating meeting. Here's my declaration of interest, just to get that out of the way. As Alison said, I'm Head of Innovation and a Product Specialist for IMT International, and we develop, manufacture, market and distribute the Matcha electronic witnessing product for fertility centres and donor banks worldwide. On the 8th of April 1912, the RMS Titanic started her maiden voyage from Southampton to New York, and as we all know, she never arrived, but instead, the supposedly unsinkable state-of-the-art vessel hit an iceberg off the coast of Newfoundland, and in just 2 hours and 40 minutes, lay at the bottom of the North Atlantic. 1,500 souls were sunk without trace. After years of investigation, we now know that the root causes of the Titanic tragedy were actually a number of human factors. For instance, due to a reshuffle of the crew at the last minute, the second officer who held the key to the binoculars locker didn't make the trip, but he forgot to hand over the one and only key. This meant that the lookouts in the crow's nest had to rely on their eyesight alone to spot approaching hazards. There was no clearly defined procedure or SOP agreed upon in advance to deal with the event of a fast approaching iceberg, and the lines of communication for transmitting a mayday were diverted so that one of the aristocrats on board could phone home to check on the welfare of her cats. This, coupled with the fact that the autocratic person responsible, Captain Smith, failed to heed the advice of the shipping industry experts, and he deemed that the likelihood of the ship sinking was so low that only the bare minimum number of lifeboats was installed, just enough to tick the box and to satisfy the shipping regulators' requirements. As we know with hindsight, this number turned out to be wholly inadequate. As well as claiming that the Titanic was unsinkable, Captain Smith is also famously quoted as saying, "We do not make mistakes on the Titanic, and we do not tolerate people who do." Boy, did he get that one wrong. At the end of the day, a very large and heavy ship collided with a very large and heavy iceberg and sank. This classic never event, as we would call it in healthcare, was wholly preventable, and would never have happened if there had been adequate systems in place. So what, I hear you cry, does this sinking of the Titanic have to do with cryogovernance? Well, apart from the fact that the North Atlantic is freezing cold, there are a number of parallels and lessons that we can learn from this Titanic story. Firstly, we need to acknowledge that every serious adverse event, without exception, will always have one or more human factors as the root cause. This could be any one of the famous dirty dozen of human factors, including distraction, lack of resources, stress, complacency, lack of teamwork, pressure, and lack of awareness. We should also include norms, which is the narrow-minded acceptance that this is just the way that we do things around here. This is the if it ain't broke, don't fix it mentality. With awareness in mind, there are already a number of identified hazards that relate specifically to cryogovernance and the systems by which all processes relating to cryopreservation of gametes and embryos are directed and controlled. And there's also included in much of the guidance some advice on how best to control these hazards or even how to avoid them altogether. In terms of a fertility centre's licensing requirements, this is called external compliance, and this should not be considered as just a box ticking exercise. This was the mistake that Captain Smith made with the lifeboats on the Titanic. It also falls upon the shoulders of the policymakers within the fertility centres and donor banks to implement adequate safety measures. This is internal compliance, and just like the tip of the iceberg, which sits just above the waterline, there are clearly visible hazards which have already been identified by our competent authorities, regulators, and purveyors of best practice. Hazards such as those described in the EU Tissues and Cells Directive, SART regulations, CAP accreditation, and the ASRM and HFEA codes of best practice, to name just a few. These are identified hazards that have the potential to cause major harm to our ship's passengers, who are the patients in our case, and their most valuable possessions, their gametes and embryos, but also major harm to our ship's crew, our valuable embryologists, our cryostores managers, the quality managers, and persons responsible. Apart from vessel integrity and liquid nitrogen management and the risk of infectious disease, or transmission of infectious disease, which falls outside of the scope of this brief talk, the list of identified hazards is quite clear and succinct. When considering cryogovernance, our particular icebergs include the risk of misidentifying a gamete or embryo as part of the process upstream of cryopreservation or vitrification. There's the risk of the sample being exposed to a harmful product or a factor as part of its processing. The risk of inadequate or illegible labeling on a straw, vial, or vitrification device. The risk of the label becoming detached or falling off the sample whilst it's in storage. The risk of a consent period elapsing before renewal, the risk of losing or not being able to keep track of a gamete or embryo as it's moved within a vessel or from one vessel to another, or on its journey to a new location. The risk of not being able to find an embryo because of poor or inadequate record keeping, and the risk of thawing or transferring the wrong gamete or embryo to the patient, which includes the risk of selecting the wrong donor. So that's quite a long list of already identified hazards. And we don't have to look very far to find many examples where catastrophic mistakes have occurred. Here's just a handful of cases that have occurred just over the last few years. Just a few of the examples of many other case studies that we've compiled over the last decade, and we'd be happy to share this list with anybody who would like that. These examples not only highlight the mistakes that do happen, sorry, Captain Smith, but they also help us to understand why mistakes happen. So we can hopefully develop countermeasures to help in trapping, preventing, and mitigating some of these risks. And we know from the studies based on the reporting of never and near events that many of these errors are linked to the processing, storage and transfer of material, as well as poor record keeping. And patients know that errors happen too, because there are many examples across all forms of media. In addition to the personal tragedy experienced by patients, errors have very many negative consequences for the clinics too, such as litigation and reputational damage. To make matters worse, there's further hazards lurking just below the surface. These are the real dangers that are likely to catch us unawares if we're not careful. And the main reasons why implementing well-developed quality management systems in fertility centres and donor banks must be done sooner rather than later. Because of a growth in clinic numbers, the passage of time, an industry-wide shift to single embryo transfer, and freeze-all instead of fresh transfer, these hazards include an exponential increase in the number of gametes and embryos stored. Preferential selection of embryos is also commonplace now, which means the identity of the patient is not the only important factor, but also the identity of the individual embryo. And also, because there's been an almost complete shift to vitrification of embryos in oocytes, the samples stored are far more cryosensitive and vulnerable to exposure to high temperatures. And this makes the physical auditing of samples and the safe movement of samples especially challenging. And Dr. Dawn Kelk will be talking about this in her intriguing talk later. So let's talk about some practical steps. Firstly, having an adequate labeling system is mission critical. If we take a step back and just think about this for a moment, handwriting on a Petri dish or a test tube, and especially on a PCR tube or a straw or a vitrification device where there's extremely limited space, is quite frankly absurd, and it's incredibly dangerous. This is because the misreading of just a single piece of critical information in the process chain can lead to the wrong baby being born. Handwriting on straws is asking for trouble because of the variability and illegibility of a person's text. There are times when I can't even read my own writing, but that's another story. One must, at the very least, use a printed label. This is basic. In my view, this should be mandated. But even on a printed label containing the minimum 3 identifiers, even with the biggest and the boldest text possible, on a small vitrification device under liquid nitrogen, it's still very hard to read with 100% accuracy. So this is where the barcode is key. There are many reasons why barcodes give you a huge comparative advantage. For example, you don't have to manually read the information because the machine or the imaging scanner does this for you, and it even records a photograph at the same time. This means that you can totally replace the human witness through the entire cycle of treatment. Secondly, you can use the barcode to search for the correct patient. Often we find that dishes and straws will match together as part of a procedure, but this is no good if they do not belong to the patient that you think you should be working on. If, however, you do want to read the information on a dish at the back of an incubator or on a tiny little vitrification device in a vessel, for instance, then with the barcode, there's no need to strain your eyes like the lookouts on the Titanic. You just simply zap the barcode with an imaging scanner and the information will pop up on the screen in large text. It will even provide a summary of all of the embryos or gametes available in the cryo stores for this patient. Very convenient. Barcodes can also be used to link and track all products, everything coming into contact with a patient and their gametes and embryos, which also can include electronic stock management and automatic expiry date alerts. And this is functionality that's already fully developed in the electronic systems such as Matcha. I hate using this phrase, but the chain really is only as strong as its weakest link, which is why in a decent electronic witnessing system, this should be used all the way through the cycle, including in all of the steps leading up to cryopreservation, storage, distribution. For a robust cryogovernance, there should be absolutely no gaps in this chain of custody. And also, throughout embryo selection and warming, an electronic witnessing system will also mitigate the risk of error to complete the cycle at the point of embryo transfer or insemination. This is far better and it's far more reliable than a human can ever be. Because every barcode is unique, it's also possible to verify that not only the correct patient is selected, but also that the correct embryo has been selected, which is crucial where embryos have been preferentially selected through time-lapse or pre-implantation genetic testing, or just simply based on quality. Then one question I'm commonly asked is, will an electronic witnessing system mean that I have to spend more time witnessing? My answer to that's no. It's actually quite the opposite. A good system can actually save the users significant time because a second human isn't required to perform the witnessing step. That also means that there's a cost saving as well. So the transition to electronic witnessing and cryo-management is also very quick and it's easy to implement. So it's really surprising that more than 90% of fertility centres have still not taken the plunge into electronic witnessing. An electronic recording system or database that's capable of real-time automatic data capture and capturing business information at the same time is also mission critical, and it's an essential part of any centre's total quality management. In this digital age, the thought of maintaining cryostraws management in a manual paper-based system to me just seems just as absurd as handwriting on dishes, tubes and straws. Unfortunately, we're not strangers to electronic and automated systems, which are already established in most fertility centres and donor banks. At the very least, most centres have already chosen an electronic management record system, or an EMR, and thankfully have already moved away from paper systems. Although it is interesting that during our time visiting many fertility centres around the world, we still observe that cryo inventory, especially historical data, is often still captured and stored in paper records without any electronic backup. This is one of the areas that's yet to be transitioned fully, which is of course quite risky. A very interesting subject also, and one that's often asked about, it's also high on our list as developers of these types of systems, is the linking together of all of the different databases to avoid duplication and transcription errors. This can actually be done quite simply in a variety of ways, including using what's called a web API interface. In layman's terms, this basically means that we can create a bespoke app to convert complex data from many databases into simple and clear calls to action that can be shared between the databases. In the context of cryogovernance, we're also able to facilitate access to centralized data from any location, which is not only great, convenient, especially in this day and age, but it's also vital where cryo inventory is being moved around the globe through a hub and spoke type system. For instance, linking an electronic witnessing system to a variety of EMRs is now commonplace. This does not just have to be restricted to importing patient details. For instance, we're pleased to be working with a number of companies like Mellowood Medical. They're the developers of the Ideas EMR, for instance. And we're discovering just what can be achieved by passing information captured in real time, using a barcode system or tracking system, for instance, and passing that directly into the patient's EMR, including into their cryo-management system. Also, the work that we're currently doing in collaboration with the Danish-based donor bank, Cryos, is another great example of how we can work very well in practice. Within a relatively short time frame, we've so far been able to transition to a fully electronic system that links together many of the processes already in place. So this includes donor registration, labeling, sperm oocyte and embryo processing, and evaluation of those samples. It also includes storage and distribution. And this has really enabled a vastly improved and more robust quality framework. It just goes to show that cooperation between the different systems really can have a huge positive impact on a centre's performance. Okay, so with the limited time I've left, I just want to mention another valuable aspect of making the transition from manual systems to electronic systems, and this is reporting and analytics. Having the ability to report all witnessed events by date and time, or by user, or by location, and also being able to track all movements into and out of, and even from within the cryo inventory, and also have the ability to easily report out this data, including stock levels, is very useful. Another example is consent expiry alerts. It's also a simple but very useful feature of the electronic system, because they can automatically alert the cryostores manager that a consent period needs to be renewed, or obsolete samples need to be just cleared out of the cryostore, reducing space, making more space available rather, and further reducing the risk of error. There've also been a number of studies published on the efficacy and inherent risks of the manual cryostores auditing, most notably by the Ovation Group and also by authors such as Tomlinson et al. Especially now with the increased vulnerability of vitrified samples, it should really be debated if this outdated manual practice, paper-based practice, should be replaced by a much safer digital alternative. But it's not just about error prevention, it's also about becoming more efficient with our limited resources. I think we can all identify with that. And knowledge is power, and having the ability to say what you do what you say, prove it, and also analyze the data collected to perform better sits right at the heart of total quality management and cryogovernance. And finally, to make the task of transitioning to electronic systems seem a little less daunting, let us spare a thought for our bovine counterparts. Whilst working as a lab manager in the world's largest cattle breeding companies, we would regularly process and cryopreserve ejaculates containing in excess of 30 billion sperm, every ejaculate. Each ejaculate could be diluted to produce more than 1,000 straws of semen, and we would regularly collect from 40 to 50 bulls every single day. Here's a rare glimpse of the largest sperm bank in the world. This is handling a throughput of around 4 million semen straws every year, with more than 20 million straws in stock at any given time. And that's just in the UK hub. There are 3 other hubs dotted around the world with a global distribution network. So I'm sure if they can manage this without making a single mistake, I'm sure we can. Oh yeah, and I almost forgot to mention the key to the Titanic's binoculars locker did eventually turn up 95 years after she sank. But to recite the words of the famous American historian Alan Nevins, this was too little, too late. I certainly don't think in this context that RMS stands for Risk Management Solutions. Thank you. I'd be very happy to take any questions either now or at the end of the session.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Matt, for this very interesting presentation. And actually, we have one question that we can start answering now. Right. And the answer would be, sorry, the question would be either by RFID or barcode, can we really trace sample in this way when performing embryo biopsies and also once it enters the dewars? Or isn't there a sort of a gap in traceability in the system?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it is an area that's kind of almost exploded into the industry within the last 3 to 5 years. It's actually almost doubled the witnessing requirement, doubled the amount of processing without really taking into account the resources that are put towards that. So yes, it's a massive challenge. We've tackled that head on as developers. We have developed a system for being able to uniquely identify every label, which can be adhered to each well in a culture dish, for instance. Those corresponding numbered wells can then be matched to the corresponding biopsy dish, which can then be matched to its corresponding PCR tube. So that links all of that side of the process together. And then on the opposite side, matching that single well to its corresponding vit dish and to its vitrification device, so that even though they're two separate processes, it's having the verification that the biopsy contained in the PCR tube does indeed match the label on the vitrification device containing the embryo. That then goes into cryo storage, and then using a system of preferential selection, we can even select the embryos that we need to remove to verify that we're taking out the right one. And we're hearing stories coming out about where there has been misidentification or misselection of preferentially selected embryos. So it's a really important feature that we've developed. So yes, you can do it. We're developing it further as well, because this is a huge area of risk which needs to be sorted out. So this might need to extend further into the PGS service providers activity, for instance, to complete that loop.
Yes, well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for this very clear and comprehensive answer. So we will move on now, and I would like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Dawn Kelk. She received her PhD in '97 and HCLD certification in the year 2000, and she has directed IVF laboratory in the US and in Canada. And she has done this for both private companies, private practices, and academic institutions. She's been the director of the IVF laboratory at Yale Fertility Center and also a research associate scientist at the Yale University School of Medicine since 2014. But prior to that, Dr. Kelk was actually the IVF laboratory director for RMA of Connecticut and the University of Colorado. Her clinical and research interests are quite diverse. They range from, for instance, trophectoderm biopsy and PGT, vitrification of embryos and oocytes, but also quite interestingly to the analysis of the liquid nitrogen cryostorage tank failures, the laser impact on embryo biopsies, and predictors of endometrial receptivity. And she's also an active member of the ASRM and the SRBT. Her presentation is quite aptly, I have to say, entitled Embryo Road Trip, Moving Cryo Inventory to a New Lab, the Yale Experience. So Dawn, over to you. The floor is yours. And thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for that introduction. I'm really happy to be here and part of the cryogovernance talk. I was tasked with discussing my experience with moving embryo inventory from one lab to another. And my most recent experience, not my first, but my most recent experience has been with Yale Fertility Center. So with that, we'll get on. I have no commercial interest for anything related to this talk. So all of this is just experience and information that I've gleaned from various people that I've worked with over the years. So I'd like to do a quick overview of the talk. What I'll do is talk a little bit about the background on liquid nitrogen dewars and shipping, the components of a successful lab move or cryo move, considerations for a successful lab move, and then options for moving your cryo inventory, and then a little bit specifically about the Yale experience. So one of the first things I'd like to draw everybody's attention to, because I know there still are quite a few people that ship with commercial companies, and I thought it's important for everybody to be aware that FedEx, in their 208-page service guide, right down next to human corpses and human body parts, are human embryos, which are listed as prohibited items. So it's important to verify with your commercial shipping company whether they allow shipment of human eggs, sperm, and embryos. So that was just a little reminder. The other thing that I think we've all had experience with over the years is some pretty egregious mishandling of packages. And the photo on the right is the back of a shipping truck. So just a reminder of how important it is to package our stuff correctly. I think we're all aware that dry shippers need to be charged with liquid nitrogen, but they should not be full of liquid nitrogen when they're actually shipped. They need to be kept upright. And I put this picture in mostly to discuss the difference between the mushroom containers and shipping in a box style shipper. The nice thing about the mushrooms is they're really designed so that the shipper, for the most part, won't lie them on their side. And despite all of the packaging and markings on the package to indicate that this package should stay upright, frequently they're not. And in the last 6 months, I had a shipper, I went to the lab door and the shipper handed me, the shipping company, the delivery guy handed me a box sideways, lying down, and just handed it to me like that. And I thought, oh, how do you deal with that? And the reason that that's important is that same principle that sends the hot air balloons in the air is the same principle that's going to cool your tank off as all of that cold air flows out of your shipping container. So again, if you think about that package lying on its side in the back of a truck, bouncing back and forth, if you package your straws in a cane with a goblet in an open system, sort of like shown on the bottom here, you can imagine where those straws are going to end up. They're going to come out of that goblet. They're going to end up bouncing around inside your shipping container. So I think it's really important to consider using a top goblet to lock those straws in place on the cane, and to also use a cane sheath. And I'm personally aware of 2 instances in the last few months where cane sheaths were not used. And a colleague of mine called me and said, it was a doc that called me and said, so is it standard of care to ship with a cane sheath? And I thought, well, is it standard of care? I mean, certainly in my books, I think it's absolutely standard of care. But I've certainly received lots of samples that cane sheaths were not in play. But I know of 2 instances in the last few months where eggs or embryos were lost in transit because cane sheaths were not used. So just putting that plug in there for everybody. So some of the other information that we know about cryo tank construction. This is a particular tank that I cut open myself with my husband. And what this shows is that the way these tanks are constructed is there's a fiberglass collar that's basically glued at the neck. So it's a tank inside a tank with a vacuum jacket, just like your coffee thermos. But it's literally held in place with that fiberglass collar glued at the neck. And the reason that that's important, you can see just how fragile these are, how much movement you can have with that air tank. So you do want to be gentle as you're moving those tanks around. I know they look like metal tanks, but they're more fragile than you might imagine. And if that vacuum jacket is breached, then the tank will thaw. The good news that we know is that it takes about 18 to 19 hours from the time that a vacuum jacket fails until the specimens are thawed. So this is from an abstract that we did a couple of years ago, where we actually induced tank failure and then measured the tank and measured the temperature inside the tank. And it's very graphic. Certainly within 20 minutes of a vacuum jacket failing, you start to see frost forming on the lid of the tank. And within 7 hours, I mean, the tank looks like a complete snowman. So, so the good news is it gave us some peace of mind when we're shipping to know that the 15-minute trip from one location to the other wasn't really a big concern, because even if the tank failed, we had backup. And that was certainly lots within our time of travel. So what we do know about tank failure, and you can model after the Cryo Sentinel alarm, this principle is based on what the Cryo Sentinel alarm does. We know that when a tank begins to fail, the surface temperature drops. As that vacuum jacket fails, it's not insulating as well, and the surface temperature of the tank will drop. And you can actually use that as an alarm condition. And the Cryo Sentinel alarm does that. It monitors the surface temperature. When it sees that dropping, it'll send an alarm to you. Then this is particular with thermal imaging. But you can also manage those with manual monitoring. So you can use a small handheld thermometer. You see these thermometers all over the place now measuring people's forehead temperatures. But you can use a laser thermometer and just go around and shoot the surface temperature of all of your tanks. And when the tanks are all together in a room, they should all be within a degree of one another. You'll find that they'll be close to room temperature and they'll be within about a degree of each other. Certainly if I was going around and shooting 10 or 20 tanks with that thermometer, which really only takes a couple of seconds, if I saw a tank that was 3 degrees different, I would be concerned and I would be monitoring that tank closely and moving my samples out. So moving on to options for a cryo move. Certainly, I know a lot of old school lab directors over the years that have performed self-transport. I wouldn't advise it these days. I don't think most people would do it now, but self-transport over the years has certainly been performed. Other companies such as Cryoport have shipping facilities to help you with the move. IVF Cryo is another company that has moves. And the company that we used with Yale Fertility was Accelerated Laboratory Logistics. Now, when you talk to some of these different companies, they have different suggestions or methods of moving. Some of the companies suggest that you take all of your samples, take them out of their current storage tanks and move them into a dry shipper, a gigantic dry shipper that might be on a pallet, and then move the samples that way in the dry shipper rather than transporting liquid nitrogen. So again, just different options. Other places will transport your samples in their storage dewars. And certainly the storage dewars need to get to the other end as well. So I wanted to talk a little bit about successful lab relocation. And one of the biggest factors is it's really important to plan ahead, to do the prep work, to plan at least 4 months ahead of time. And you need to account for all the materials and equipment, comprehensive lists, who's going to move what. Will your cryo alarm system work at the new location? Does it need rewiring? Will your wireless signal work at that new location? What we found with Yale, the cell signal at that particular location was a little bit sketchy. So we had to make sure that our alarm system was going to be sufficient when we got there. Liability insurance will also take some time and planning if you're trying to get that sorted out for the move as well. So planning ahead, it's really important to consider the loading docks and the elevators at each end. Consider a backup day for weather, regardless of whether you live in the Northeast, and Yale's move was done in February in Connecticut, so it could have been a snowstorm, but even in areas where snow is not an issue, you can still have rain and other bad weather that you may not want to contend with when you're trying to move tanks. Consider the time of day, the traffic that you're going to encounter, and those sorts of factors. Certainly, spare tanks should be transported along with the full tanks so that you've got backup. If a tank did fail, you can move your samples over. And do you have your own spare tanks? And I would certainly suggest that any lab should have a spare tank. If you've got samples in a 10K tank, you should have another empty 10K tank in your lab, because if that tank fails, you need a place to put those samples. If you've got all your samples in 47-liter tanks, then you should have an empty 47-liter tank in your lab at all times. So I would say that any self-respecting lab should have their own spare tanks, but if for some reason you don't, and you have some other backup plan for your samples, you can talk to some of these suppliers. Some of these movers will supply spare tanks, so that's something you can consider as well. In planning the move, we know that transporting liquid nitrogen is different from dry shippers. Liquid nitrogen poses an asphyxiant risk, and those tanks really need to be enclosed in a compartment separate from the driver. it's important to have O2 sensors in the transport vehicle with the tanks. And labeling and inventory transportation manifests are also something that need to be dealt with. And each location will have its own, or each country will have its own regulations for shipping hazardous materials, such as liquid nitrogen. The US Department of Transportation has special requirements for shipping liquid nitrogen. So you need to make sure that you have all of that documentation taken care of. And the movers, for the most part, will help you with all of that. So for Yale, the considerations for choosing a mover were that we had specimens dating back 30 plus years. The program's been in existence for a long time. And so we literally had, some of the samples were actually in glass vials, glass ampules. And these devices here are straws and embryos that were actually discarded in the last 6 months at Yale. So we had a lot of different devices frozen. And so for us, we really wanted to make sure that the samples stayed in their storage tanks. We didn't want to have to deal with trying to pull all of those samples out and put them into a dry shipper for shipping. So that was a big consideration for us. We had 3 of the 10K tanks, like the big square one at the bottom here. We had about 24 47-liter storage dewars and 10 of the 23-liter shorter dewars that you see on top. The move for Yale Fertility was about 6 miles down Interstate 95. And the liability ultimately was with Yale in the end. And failure is just really not an option in these circumstances. I did speak with one of the companies that does these kinds of moves. They said they had done a $40 million liability insurance move. And we talked about if you split your samples into multiple runs, you can decrease your liability insurance. So if you have $40 million worth of liability, and you split that into 2 runs, you could potentially decrease your liability insurance to $20 million. So as far as Yale was concerned, the way that I started was I researched all of the options that were out there, and I went to somebody whom I respect and trust. And for me, that was Amy Sparks at the University of Iowa, who had recently done a move before us. And Amy's got this wonderful YouTube video online, and the link's there if anybody wants to pull that up. They did sort of a nice informational video for patients to put them at ease, which was really beautifully done. And for us, we wanted to transport the specimens in the storage dewars, as I mentioned. And we just felt like we had way too much inventory to move into dry shippers for transportation. And because of the various devices that things were frozen on, it just didn't make sense for us to try and move things into a dry shipper. So we ended up choosing an experienced mover that's moved the likes of the CDC and NASA, and that was Accelerated Laboratory Logistics. And this was the same mover that had moved the University of Iowa. And this is photos from the University of Iowa's YouTube video. They used a police escort. This image shows you the kind of moving racks and facilities that they have. They have proper dollies to strap all of these tanks on. It's really important not to try and transport on the little roller bases that we all use around our lab. So those are made to roll your tank around the lab like 5 feet to move your tanks to fill them maybe or whatever, or to move them out to get your samples out. Those are not made to be moving over door thresholds and onto elevators and up and down and around. So you don't want to be moving them around on those. You want to have proper dollies to move your stuff, move those tanks. When those tanks get put into the truck, they're all strapped down on those solid dollies so that everything's secure for the move. For the Yale experience, in the end, for the lab move, we used 3 different movers. We used a commercial mover, Clancy, and Clancy was chosen by the university, by Yale. And they were moving the whole clinic. So they were moving the furniture, the refrigerators, the large equipment. We also used a specialty mover. We went back to Next Gen Life Labs because they were the ones that were going to set up our equipment at the other end, make sure our lasers were aligned. So we used Next Gen Life Labs to move our sensitive equipment, the microscopes and lasers and such. And then the cryo move was done by Accelerated Laboratory Logistics, and they were the ones to move all of the cryo tanks. So it was important because we were coordinating with 3 different movers. Each mover had a dedicated move window. And it was important not to have those movers in each other's way and competing for elevators and loading docks. So each mover actually had their own day or their own half day to get their move done. We also planned for a backup day. So we had a snow day planned. Fortunately, we didn't need to use it. And for Yale, we planned for the cryo move to do 3 different trips between andrology and embryology. We chose to make the move during the day after the morning rush, but during daylight hours. We did discuss, does it make sense to do it at night? But we didn't think that, doing it in the dark, in the dead of night made a lot of sense for us. We discussed the possibility of using surface roads, but that meant a lot of stoplights and a lot of stops and starts, which we didn't think was in the best interest of the tanks. So we chose to do a direct route on I-95, Interstate 95, rather than the surface roads. We used a police escort, which I think is absolutely crucial for this kind of a move. So we had 2 police escorts, one in front and one behind, that buffered us along the highway and gave us lots of space from the other traffic. We transported spare tanks with us along with the full tank. So if we were transporting a 10K tank, we had an empty 10K tank in the truck with us. Same thing, if we were transporting 47-liter tanks, we had an empty, full of nitrogen, but empty tank that we could take the samples and put immediately into if there was ever any issue with any of the tanks. So we had 2 portable O2 sensors in the truck with the tanks that we carried along, so that we had those. And we had Yale Safety to ensure that the Department of Transport labeling and compliance was all done. So that was something that I didn't need to worry about, which was nice. What we did with our tanks was we monitored the doer surface temperature before and after the move. They were also monitored with tank alarms, but that surface temperature gave us a little additional peace of mind to make sure that the integrity of the vacuum jacket on those tanks before and after the move was secure. And this is a video of the actual move from Yale. This is our police escort, and they were great. They literally blocked the intersection coming off of I-95. This is the president of the company that was moving us in the first car. That's the truck with the embryos in it. They let me follow along in my car behind, and then the other police chase car. And this is coming into the campus itself. So fortunately, you can see that we had good weather despite it being February. And the truck just looks like a nondescript truck as it's traveling down the highway, but the police escort was certainly nice to give us that security as we moved. So in summary, it's important to plan ahead for these kinds of moves. Do the walkthrough or rehearse the trips, do the drive, figure out the actual walking through the logistics of loading docks and elevators and the such. Plan the route, plan the time of day, absolutely use a police escort. transport with spare tanks, use portable O2 sensors for safety. And those portable O2 sensors are a couple $100 that you can just easily purchase online. Ensure that you have appropriate Department of Transportation labeling and compliance. And I would really recommend monitoring the surface temperature of your tanks before and after the move. So that was sort of the experience. I'm more than happy to answer questions. I'd like to thank the I3 group for inviting me to discuss my experience. And my contact information's on the bottom here. If anybody has any questions you want to discuss, I'm more than happy for anybody to reach out to me and discuss that. So thanks so much.
Thank you. That was really, really interesting. Thank you very much, Dawn.
Sorry for the interruption along the way.
It wasn't so bad. We kept ourselves busy, and it'll all be edited beautifully, seamlessly together, I'm sure. Just a quick question, if you don't mind. What about risk assessments? So presumably you did all these risk assessments before you set off, before you, all these 4 months preparation. And a question as well about would insurance companies be able to insure you for this sort of move, and would they demand risk assessments? If so,
well, ultimately this move was insured by Yale because it was ultimately on Yale. None of these moving companies are really gonna, as they're relatively small companies, so they're not gonna take on that liability. When I spoke with IVF Cryos, they said that they had managed to purchase liability insurance, but it really depends on the specifics of it. So in our Yale case, it was Yale that had covered the liability. I mean, we did a lot of backflips trying to figure out, and ultimately it's priceless. There's no way to really put a price on what we actually moved.
No, exactly. It's the precious cargo indeed. Okay, well, thank you very much. We'll move on to the next presentation. This is the third and final presentation before we go to the Q&A session. So I now have the pleasure of introducing the next speaker, Dr. Janice Vilela, who will discuss the importance of ovarian tissue transportation for fertility outcomes. Dr. Janice Vilela is a postdoc researcher at the Gynecology Laboratory from the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium. She holds a bachelor's degree in veterinary medicine, a master's degree in compared animal physiology, and a PhD in animal biology. Her research is focused on fertility preservation, conducting studies on ovarian tissue cryopreservation, transplantation, and metabolism of human and other mammalian species. So thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Vilela, and over to you.
Thank you, Alison, for this introduction. Thank you, I3, for the invitation, Giles. So I'm gonna share my screen. Oh, wait, I forget that I have to do this in the opposite order. So you can see. Do you see the full screen? Okay, so just a second, because this is, I'm trying to change the window here and it's not going. Okay, let's go. So my presentation will go a bit in a different way than the past two, because while we have some protocols already developed for embryos and eggs and even sperm, we don't have the same for ovarian tissue. And I'm going to talk about fresh ovaries, not frozen, which is more of a challenge. And I will show you today why we should give more attention to this topic. So chemotherapy and radiotherapy are successful techniques to treat many types of cancer, but not without serious consequences, such as infertility and sterility, also depression, psychological disorders, and sexuality issues. To overcome or try to overcome these issues, some fertility preservation techniques have been developed, such as egg and embryo cryopreservation and ovarian tissue cryopreservation. The latter one is especially important because it's the only option for pre-pubertal girls and for when treatment cannot be delayed. And how does it work? Well, we need to remove the tissue. Let me put my laser here so I can point things to you. So we remove the tissue before the woman goes to the for the cancer treatment. We take it to a laboratory. Oops, sorry, it moved. We take the tissue to a laboratory where it will be frozen and kept in liquid nitrogen. And then once the treatment is finished, we can transplant it back to the patient. Oops. And once the cancer treatment is finished, they can be transplanted back for the return of her menstrual cycle and a chance for a natural pregnancy. This technique is also promising to delay menopause, which raises even more the demand of this kind of procedure. Currently, we have more than 150 live births to date, with successful pregnancy rates of around 50% and live births around 41%. And in several countries, this is not considered experimental technique anymore. But there are some limitations to perform this technique. We need specific equipment to perform cryopreservation. We need trained professionals able to prepare and freeze the ovary. And there are also many European directives and high costs to create and maintain a tissue bank, which means only large facilities, only large hospitals can have this kind of facilities. So how can we increase the access to this strategy? One way is to improve ovarian tissue transportation, which will allow small clinics in less developed countries to offer this service to their patients. They would remove their ovaries in the clinics and send them to the big hospitals to be frozen and then preserved. Currently, we have a few reports on the situation, such as the Danish network, which can take up to 5 hours to get to its destination, the tissue, and also Fertility Protect network, which includes centers from Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, which now they transport tissues for up to 24 hours, 22 to 24 hours. However, while these results have shown that long periods of transportation do not decrease pregnancy and live birth rates, these protocols have been empirically developed. And I want to show you today why we need to pay attention to this topic and what we already know and about how it affects fertility. I made a systematic review on the topic, focusing only on manuscripts that tested different conditions for the transport. And I found 46 studies. Here we see a graph with all the species that we saw, and only 4 studies were in human. The others were performed in 10 different animal species. So I decided to spot the patterns within these studies to understand how each parameter would affect the ovary. In general, the parameters evaluated were temperature, time, and medium used for transportation. I'll show quickly in the next slides a bit about it. So regarding time, we have 18 different time points shown here. These are the species, each color is one species. I forgot, it's not showing here the legend, but it's not really important at the time. So 18 different time points, but only 34 out of 46 studies studied the effect of time in transportation. And 12 and 24 hours were the most used time points in all the studies. About temperature, we have 28 studies that evaluated the effect of temperature. And in total, 16 different temperatures were used, being 4 and 20 degrees the most used ones. And when we check the media studied for the transportation, we see 20 different media, being saline solution, PBS, and MEM, the most used ones. But out of the 46 studies, only 13 were actually comparing different media. The others were just using that media to compare time, temperature, or their relations. And 6 assessed additives in media, and those are really interesting. I'm gonna talk about them. And how were these parameters assessed? So I summarized these findings and observed this graph, and about the main focus of the analysis. So we have main focus of oocyte and ovarian tissue, And only 4 studies analyzed embryos, 4 studies analyzed media, and 1 analyzed the offspring. I will talk about that also. And DNA was analyzed in 10 studies. Here we see all the analyses that were performed. I grouped them to see. You see that are so many. They are not standardized, and each study decided about which one would use. But I'm gonna focus here the main aspects regarding fertility that could be interesting for us to see. First, let's see the effects on oocyte maturation and fertilization and embryo production. Every aspect that I show from now on has been impacted by both, all 3 of these parameters. So one affects the other. There are no individual results. We will try to analyze them more or less separately, but they are interfering with one another. And another important thing is that these studies are from animal studies. There are no reports on human for these conditions. These studies use different conditions for transportation, then performed follicle or oocyte isolation, in vitro culture, in vitro maturation, and sometimes fertilization as a way to assess their tested conditions. What we see here is that temperature and time affected oocyte viability, meiotic resumption rates, cleavage rate, blastocyst formation, and oocyte maturation. Also, embryo development in different species. We have many studies regarding this, and normally lower temperatures tend to preserve better the oocytes and improve all of these parameters. In cats, there were 4 studies regarding this kind of assessment, and I will show one of them in more details because it's really interesting and more recent. It's from 2018, and these authors, they compared transporting PBS, just 1 media, at 4 degrees, and made a lot of analysis. So they observed progressive decrease in morphologically normal follicles, tubulin distribution progressively disrupted, decrease of cleavage rate from 48 hours of transport, which is very long, lower blastocyst yield from 48 hours transport again, and progressive increase of reactive oxygen species and apoptosis. Here we see a picture of the ROS increase along time, which is very interesting to see. And here we see that it really affects the oocyte in many ways, even when it's ovarian tissue that we are transporting. We also see a benefic effect of additives in media every time they were used. Superoxide dismutase, SOD, SOD, improved cleavage rates and blastocyst formation in cat ovaries. Melatonin improved embryo quality in sheep, and the use of glutathione, GSH, and epigallocatechin gallate, AGCG, improved blastocyst formation in cow ovaries. And it's very interesting that 15 degrees were still very good. All these results are very interesting, show that the transportation really has an impact on fertility outcomes. And how about ovarian tissue? I started my presentation talking about how ovarian tissue cryopreservation is very important. So there's something that we need to remember and consider here, that the ovary is very complex, and there is a diversity of cells and structures whose interaction is essential for follicle survival and development. So all of the cells in the ovary are really important for the follicle. So we cannot really analyze them separately. All of them are necessary. And with that in mind, transportation is a challenging subject. When we look into the studies that analyze the tissue and not cells or embryos, we see that main analyses performed were related to follicle morphology, cell viability after transport, or cryopreservation. So they did the transport and analyzed immediately after the transport, or did in vitro culture and then analyzed follicle morphology. DNA fragmentation was also very used as an analysis here. And regarding media, all of our studies, our observations are related to animal studies. Here I show a table extract with the human studies, are only 4. So each one used only 1 medium. comparing different temperatures, one of them only, and normally they were testing just time points. So about the medium, there is clearly an effect of media composition in cell viability, follicle morphology, or site viability. And also we see that when the authors analyzed DNA fragmentation, normally the duration of transport was reduced. And what about then transport duration? We have a specific group of studies. These are all from the same group in goats, and they tested many conditions in different studies and show that lower temperatures usually tend to preserve morphology closer to normal values in all media, but in the same temperature and time, some media show better results. So here we see many comparisons, and we see, for example, that fragments stored in coconut water presented higher percentage of morphologically normal follicles compared to brown choline solution. But PBS was also better than saline solution. So we see those differences here, and we see a clear effect of the medium. And this will be very important, again, later on. And again, when substances were added to the media, here we have plant extracts in sheep and goat ovaries and some antioxidants in sheep ovaries. The use of these substances tend to preserve morphology better as well and decrease follicular loss. And the use of additives, antioxidants, other substances to preserve organs during transportation was already deeply studied for transportation of other organs, such as kidney, heart, and pancreas. And I believe our field can benefit a lot from the knowledge acquired for these organs, and we can use this information to develop studies for ovarian tissue transportation. When we see the effects of temperature, it is clear that lower temperatures tend to better preserve follicle morphology. There is a tolerance of around 4 to 10 degrees, but most studies agree that 4 degrees is better for the follicles for up to 24 hours, which is what most of the studies consider the maximum time that we could transport the tissue. However, we also see from cryopreservation studies, we already have a lot of information about it, normal morphology does not translate to normal function. So it is necessary to allow the reestablishment of tissue activity to measure the effects of this procedure. For that, some studies used in vitro culture of ovarian fragments, which is the case of this one. It's one of the human studies. There were 2 or 3 studies in human that did in vitro culture for 24 hours or even 15 days. But this system of in vitro culture for ovarian fragments is not really well established. We have a lot of follicle loss. Even for 24 hours of culture, there's a lot of follicle loss. So it's not really an ideal system to evaluate the transport conditions. We cannot really be sure of how transport conditions affect fertility by doing in vitro culture as a way of assessing this. So there was one study in this systematic review that gave us important insights on this matter. These authors performed ovarian tissue transplantation to assess the transport of mouse ovaries at different time points. So they transported the tissue, then transplanted it to the mice, and after that they collected the oocytes and did in vitro fertilization. And although they did not observe any difference in the percentage of morphologically normal follicles immediately after transportation, there was a significant reduction in both implantation and live birth rates after transplantation and all the fertility techniques. So I want to come back to the human studies now and talk about media a bit more to show you some factors that we really need to pay attention to. First, here in the left, you see the media that are used in clinical practice today or have been used. So IVF medium, L15, SAGE, alpha-MEM, custodial, and PBS. They are reported in literature to be used for transportation of the ovary. And here the studies have been performed in Brahma, Celsior, and L15. So we have only one of those that is actually used in clinics. And we don't really have studies on all the others. And it's really important also to mention that none of those are specific for the ovary. And custodial has been validated for Fertility Protect network. It has good results, but also it's for abdominal organs, but not really for the ovary. And for the past 2 years, I have been studying the effects of ovarian tissue transportation using different media. I did my experiments in cow. One of my main findings was that there is metabolic activity in the ovary even at 4 degrees. I show here increase of lactate at 4 degrees in different media and lower rates of dead cells. And this can make all the difference for fertility outcomes. I talked about this in my presentation from last year here at I3 and my publication, which is shown here, if you are interested to understand more of this subject. So all of what I showed today is to highlight why we need to give better attention to ovarian tissue transportation. This technique is growing in importance, and from all we have observed, there's a way to improve these rates. We see here, again, a successful pregnancy rates of 50% and live births of 41%. But if we really have a standard protocol for transportation of this ovary, we can really improve these rates. And that is really, really interesting. So for that, fertility networks present a lot of advantages. When cryopreservation is performed at a specialized centers, we have highly trained staff to handle it, and it's easier to improve all these procedures when you have a large number of samples in the same place. That will help develop standard protocols that can be spread throughout the world. Of course, if the tissue is kept for a long time, it can cause the generation of antral follicles, which is all the more reason to create more of those networks and make sure that the tissue gets to the centers before 24 hours of its removal from the patient. Then the biggest challenge will be to create a reliable system for this transportation, something to keep the temperature for the time that it needs, and a logistically reliable system. So in conclusion, I would like to point out again the importance of giving more attention to ovarian tissue transportation in order to allow the creation of fertility networks and improve the fertility outcomes for everyone. For this, we need to study the media that is actually used in clinical settings, improve this media with additives, and evaluate the transported tissue with transplantation, which is currently the best way that we can really see how the follicles will behave after all is been through transportation. Thank you very much. I thank you especially Cristiane, which is my supervisor at Chine, the head of the lab, Marie-Madeleine, and our collaborators of this study. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Janice. It's really interesting, and actually, as we head off into the Q&A, I have a question myself for you. So you showed this really important need to standardize condition and to understand what's best, and I realized that the literature is really sparse. Nevertheless, do you have an idea of what are, the 1-2 absolutely critical points that we should figure out first? Is it the medium? Is it the temperature? Is it the time? What is it?
I think the temperature is what has been really established by now. Even in we don't have like studies, we have reports from the clinics, 2 or 3 reports saying how many fragments were transported for how long and everything. So 4 degrees is actually the ideal temperature, but we know that we cannot really keep it all the time in this. So I even have a spare slide here that I can show just here. This is the box that have been used for the Fertility Protect network. They use a specific box with ice inside to keep the temperature. It normally keeps from 2 to 8 degrees. And this would be a good temperature, still keeping the ovaries well preserved during this time. But yeah, that's the ideal temperature is already more or less established. For me now, and also the time for this temperature, I think what would be really interesting is that we study the medium to see what are the best ingredients for a medium for the ovary, and see what is the real impact of what we are using in the clinics, because we don't really know. So I'm working on that. I have been doing transplantation of the ovary, testing these different media, but I still don't have a statistic number to compare and show you. It's hard to collect human ovaries, so it takes a time. Yeah. But yeah, for me, the medium would be crucial at this time, and then really communication, because we know that it's not really easy to create those networks to be able to really do this in a worldwide manner, let's say.
Of course. Well, so then I guess we will be all waiting for your publication in the near future.
I hope so.
This point. Thank you very much for this answer, and also for the talk, of course. Alison, should we open the discussion?
Yes, I think so. We've had so many questions. It's yeah, so I've got one, first of all, if that's right, for Janice. We've been talking about coding and labeling quite a lot in this session. So how do you go about coding or labeling the ovarian tissue? Because presumably when it's going from the surgical hospital or wherever that surgery is taking place to the laboratory where the samples will be frozen.
Okay, I don't have any information from the literature. There is nothing really standardized for the fertility networks. I didn't see anything. What I can say is my experience in the hospital. I've been doing cryopreservations in the hospital, but it's like 1 hour of transportation, because the tissue is removed from the patient in the surgery room, and then it just gets to the room where we will prepare the tissue to be cryopreserved. So it doesn't take more than 1 hour to do that. It's not really an impact, but I know that in the hospitals, they have the labels with the name of the patient and all the information of the patient. I never saw a code, a barcode, but at least here at St. Luke, they have a good label, and all the cryotubes are also labeled with printed label, everything really standardized in this way. But that's my experience here. I don't really know in the networks that already exist.
So I guess we can just open up a little bit question to the other two speakers, to Matt and Dawn. And actually this one is for Dawn, I think. So talking about auditing, well, maybe both of you actually, how often we should do an audit on the content of the tanks, and after how many years or after how many times that we've taken things in and out of the tank, and should we audit the whole content or some sampling in a certain way that is statistically significant or something like that? Maybe Matt first. I don't know.
I think there is still an expectation that the contents of vessels should be physically audited. And that's what I sort of mentioned in my topic, that I personally don't agree with that. If you have a decent and robust system for material going into storage, then you should be able to keep a reliable track of whereabouts it is in storage. So when you come to take it out of storage, it is where you think it is, and it's the right number, and it's the right patient. But that kind of follows the garbage in, garbage out philosophy. That's only as reliable as the system that you have in place. So I think if you have a proper, fully validated, reliable, robust electronic system that really has been validated, then I personally think it's not necessary. It's actually very dangerous to start dipping in and out of tanks to count straws, particularly vitrified samples that are incredibly vulnerable to thawing. Is it really worth the risk? But I would, rather than just express my personal view, I think it's an area that needs to be revisited by our regulators and by the industry as a whole to debate whether this is an outdated and dangerous practice that should be replaced. And if that is the case, then how are we going to do it safely?
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant answer, actually, Matt. And I completely agree with you. We don't perform full physical audits in our laboratories for exactly those reasons. We've got a robust witnessing system. We think it's too risky, it's too dangerous. So sample auditing, I think, is arguably a much better way to go. The difficulty with the witnessing system, as you say, you know, the samples may be beautifully, perfectly, permanently labelled, but the location is important as well. So it's all very well, we know exactly what the sample is, but if it's been placed into the wrong location, then you may face a problem when it's time to find it. So how we handle that, apart from sample audits, would be to perform a retrospective manual physical audit. So if I've put the sample away today, then later in the day, I'd like Rita just to go and find it, not to handle it, but just to check the location. It's already been witnessed electronically or manually. We know it's the right labelled sample, but if Rita can find it an hour or two later, then we will find it in exactly the right place when it's time to thaw.
And that's certainly on the radar of developers as well. This is what we would call cryo-witnessing. So not only witnessing the identity of the patient, but also the location that item's going into and where it's coming from, just to try to add a bit of ballast to that chain of custody. Is an area that ourselves and also other developers are also really focusing on. So there's a lot of energy going into that. So I don't think it's going to be long before there are several solutions for that very thing.
I'd like to chime in for just 1 second, and I think it's dangerous to try and have a one size fits all. I've seen a lot of different labs when I've been out doing CAP inspections, a lot of the different research labs, and sometimes there are postdocs or whatever that are freezing into some of those tanks. So it's definitely the garbage in, garbage out, but there's a lot of garbage in factor that's still in people's real worlds these days. So I think Matt's response is perfect, and that's the direction we should be going, and I absolutely agree. And at the same time, so I agree that it shouldn't be a once a year kind of thing, because your integrity should be good for your tanks now, but I've also inherited some messes along my way and over the years.
What about RFID tags within cryovials? And you're mostly barcodes, Matt, but one of the questions was saying, has RFID chips, are they small enough now, and is the system robust enough to be positioned inside a cryovial? Because in theory, that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? If particularly if the straws were manufactured already with the RFID tags. So it's detected as it goes into the tank, and you can do an audit at the push of a button.
Yeah, that's kind of the holy grail, to be able to wave a wand over your tank and be able to know exactly what's in there. We know that there are developments in that area. We know that there's been some big strides in that area, particularly with companies like Tomorrow that have repositories for straws that can then track the straws within those. So there's a lot of great work going into that at the moment. There are obviously downsides as well. Having a physical label that has both the machine readable part and the eye readable part on the same label is what we would call like a belt and braces approach. Having both of those identifiers means that if one of the two fails, you still have the backup. So I think with adequate backup systems, if you could validate that RFID tags will definitely work when they come out of the nitrogen, and if they don't, what's your backup plan? Because it's very difficult to validate long-term storage of an RFID tag in the same way that you can quite easily validate long-term storage of a barcode, because they work in two distinctly different ways. We're not relying on the efficacy of the technology of the machine readable tag with a barcode system in the same way that you are with an RFID tag. So definitely I would be very positive to say that's definitely something that's coming, and I would definitely encourage that, and I think it's great what's happening. But there's also a very good reason why you can't wave a wand over a supermarket trolley and it will automatically tell you the cost of everything in it. Yeah. Leave it at that.
So there's another question. This one is definitely for Dawn, and it's about if you have a choice of moving your tanks and your samples either by road or by plane, which I guess it means that this would be a very long road trip. Which way would be best or would be advisable in your opinion?
I think it's really a specific question of what the road is and how far the distance actually is. Certainly they can be transported. If you're talking plane, then you probably are talking going into dry shippers, and it depends on the number of samples and how big of, almost anything can be palletized and transported. It's just a matter of, and some of those companies can certainly do that. The companies that I mentioned, I think, are up for those kinds of tasks if that was, if that was what was in the order. It really depends on the volume of samples that you're trying to move to.
What about this? We've talked about long-term storage. What about the life expectancy of a cryo tank? We've had a couple of questions about that.
No, that question comes up every time, and it frustrates the heck out of me because the reality is the tanks that have been in storage in use for a long time are probably better built. The tanks that have been failing are the more recently produced ones, and at the same time, I wouldn't want to have an older tank fail and have to go to court and explain why I had embryos in a tank that was 20, 30 years old. So I tend to try and take the tact of, well, what do I think is reasonable standard of care that doesn't look like I'm being delinquent? And at the same time, if you're monitoring your tanks well, we've got 18, 19 hours on those 47-liter dewars if you're not leaving them unattended. In fact, in my labs, what I actually do is have basically something that I borrowed from a McDonald's or airport bathroom, which is like, we do a physical check on the tanks in the morning when we arrive and last thing before we leave. So we basically just go around, and we can go around with the thermometer and just shoot them all the way around the room. They should all be within less than a degree difference of one another. So if their sibling tank is sitting next to them and is 2 degrees warmer than they are, then I'm like, then I'm monitoring that tank closely, and I'm getting nervous, and I'm moving stuff to my backup tank. And it is, all of those tanks are within a degree. So I actually feel more security from my physical checks of those tanks twice a day than I do from my alarm monitor, because I've had enough experiences with different labs where somebody came in, rewired the alarm system, and they didn't actually check that it didn't actually call to every single person along the way, or the phone number got changed or misentered. So I actually like the physically checking the tanks, and that gives me more, that actually helps me sleep more at night than actually my alarm system.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, definitely. And I guess a risk assessment as well. So we need early warning mechanisms. We need to have robust check-in systems, and risk assessment, rolling replacement is sensible, as you say. Yeah, I think yeah, we could do with some best practice guidelines, I would say, on all of this. And it's only relatively recently that we've realised or accepted, I think, that we have much longer than we thought. We used to imagine a catastrophic failure within half an hour, everything's gone. But of course, it's not like that, and we know much better now. So we do have time, and we do have spare tanks. So yeah, but best practice guidelines probably would be nice.
Yeah. There are actually more than one question about, let's say, the documents or the consent, and probably this is different country, but when you move the lab and move all these samples, do you tell patients, do you ask for their consent? Do you assume that you are doing basically the same thing in a different location and you just move? Do you need to inform? What's the protocol in the US, I guess, and maybe Alison, in the UK?
I think every lab is unique. If it's a lab, for instance, the lab I'm in now is only 4 years old. We've got very good tabs on all of the samples. Yale was a challenge because there were samples that were in there for more than 30 years. There were patients that had gone off the grid. And so there were a lot of samples in there that were tough to get a handle on. And it's, so you can send out your certified letters, but you're not going to reach every single individual when you're talking thousands and thousands of patients. You know, if it's a smaller clinic and you're talking, you know, a couple hundred patients, that's pretty easy to track those down. So each clinic really has to come up with their own solution. So I don't think there is a one answer for everybody.
No, and I think that they're quite discreet, the consent for storage and the contract with the clinic. So if you're moving samples within the same regulatory jurisdiction, then the consent form remains valid. But if you're moving to a different clinic, then you will need a new contract and a new sort of agreement, really. And I think the power is in the contract for patients who you lose contact with, who don't want to make a decision about the fate of their embryos. If it's all clear in the contract, then you have the authority or the confidence to deal with the situation.
I mean, I know another clinic that closed down and the patients were, you know, scrambling around trying to get other clinics to take their embryos. And a lot of the clinics around the area would decline taking those embryos because there'd been a history of mix-ups, you know, and that sort of thing. So, so it can be a very awkward situation for sure.
Mm. We've had a question about cleaning tanks, and what about Matt? You know, with all this experience with animal samples, it's probably quite different to human, but how do you clean a tank?
Well, the animal approach is a product called Virkon. I don't know if you've heard of Virkon, but it's really effective against most virus. And there's a complete washing out of tanks to remove virus or bacterial contamination whenever the opportunity arises. So it's very much more like a factory approach. You know, that there's a turnaround of vessels. The vessels get disinfected and cleaned, bearing in mind that a lot of these vessels are going onto farms. So that there's a global distribution network of vessels being couriered around by companies like Genus ABS regularly. The thousands of vessels traveling around the globe at any given point in time onto farms. Those then have to get turned around and taken back to the central hub. So it's imperative that they get cleaned before they make their way back to the central storage. So that it's all to do with the SOP, as you said, Alison. There is a very, very strict SOP in place. Everybody knows what it is. It runs like clockwork, and that's the secret to it. It's not. It becomes the routine, and that actually makes it a lot safer.
How are they decontaminating the dry shippers in the animal industry?
Yeah, that I don't actually know the answer to that because of the absorbent material in the dry shippers, but I believe it is using the same process, but there's just more of a drying afterwards. But I don't know the answer to that. Yeah. Sorry. I could find out though quite easily.
Yeah.
I think we can. We have a question for Janice, which is on mute now. So the question is, yeah. So again, I'm going back to this lack of standards that is bothering me. Is there anything that we know about the size of the pieces? Because I saw in the papers in the review there was maybe one instance of a transport of all ovary, but most of the time is in little pieces. So I imagine there would make a difference, right?
They do. I was even checking my table now to remember how many studies really checked this, like evaluated the size of the tissue. There were 2 studies that evaluated this. So they compared different sizes of the fragments to see. And yes, it's better to transport in different fragments. Normally, at least in the hospital where I've been, they, well, let's suppose this is an ovary. So they remove the cortex like round, and sometimes it's divided, but normally you have a fragment of around 1 per 1 centimeter, more or less. And then in the lab, once it gets to the lab, you cut it into more fragments to freeze. So I've been studying this maximum size of 1 centimeter per 1. But yeah, the studies show that ovarian fragments really directly influences the percentage of morphological normal follicles at the end. So this is something that we need to pay attention to. In the studies in the reports that we see for human transports, like the fertility networks, they didn't really say the size of the ovary, just say the ovaries were transported in these conditions. There is no report on the size for the clinical practice.
So more information.
Yes.
Collected and stuff.
Yes. In my experiments, I've been using more or less this size, which is what we use in the hospital. So I have an idea, but I'm not sure if it's the same size as other facilities.
Perfect. Thank you.
So what do you think, Rita? Shall we go to our competition?
Oh, yeah, I think.
Okay, so time to get to the competition before we do the wrap up. And these competition prizes are kindly sponsored by Gas Safe Consultants Limited. And we've got 3 prizes, and these are going to be access codes to a liquid nitrogen safety e-learning course. So the prizes are going to be sent out shortly after the webinar to the winners. So we're going to have 3 multiple choice questions, and we're going to ask you to send your answers, so the letters of the answers, so multiple choice, so whether it's B, C, D, or whatever like that, send it in the chat, and the fastest 3 correct answers are each going to win a safety online training course code. Okay, so get ready with your fingers, and I'll read out the 3 questions. Question 1. 1 litre of nitrogen expands to, is it A, 7 litres, B, 70 litres, or C, 700 litres of gas? And nitrogen gas safe gas, this number 2, is slightly, is it lighter or heavier than air when it reaches room temperature? And the 3rd question, what term describes why spilled nitrogen droplets skitter across the floor? So they go zipping across the floor, especially if you've got a nice smooth cryolab floor. So this is when liquid nitrogen boils so rapidly that it surrounds the surface with an insulating layer of the nitrogen gas. Is it A, patomophobia, B, Boyle's law, or C, Leidenfrost effect? So good luck. Let's see.
I see there are already so many answers. It's super fast. So just remember to write the 3 letters in the same chat message so that we know. And it's really hard to keep track. There were some very quick folks there.
Oh, I can see. I've seen 2 that have got it right. Oh, Natalie, I think you might be doing well there. I'm not sure if you're one of the fastest, but this is good fun.
Oh, yeah. It looks like everyone is answering.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay. I'm just going to go back and see. Oh, so many responses. Wow. Oh, who do you think? Oh, I don't think Pamela has it right. Oh, Derek. I don't think it. And maybe people are having a second try now. Okay, shall we have a look at the answers, the correct answers? So A, 700 litres from 1 litre of nitrogen. This is why we were talking earlier about the dry shipper. This is why I think the dry shipper must be dry, because if you had even 1 cup of liquid and it were to tip on its side in an enclosed space, perhaps in a delivery van, then it would expand and fill the cabin. So yeah, it's dangerous stuff, and of course it's odorless. You don't see it, you don't smell it, you just find the effects if you're unfortunate to be there. So oxygen depletion monitor is essential. Nitrogen gas is lighter, and this when it scurries across the floor, it's quite pretty actually, isn't it? It's the Leidenfrost effect. So brilliant, thank you very much for all those answers. Certainly 3 winners amongst them. So those prizes will be winging their way over to you.
Okay, so I think it's perhaps time to wrap up.
Did we get something wrong? We got something wrong. The first answer should be C. We did say it was 700, but I think the letter said A. But the answer is C.
Yeah. So yeah, this of course will be taken into account in checking the right.
CAC.
CAC. That's the right one. Okay. Perfect. So well, let's thank everyone for taking their time to participate in this session. Thank you, the audience, but of course, particularly, thank you to our 3 fantastic speakers, Dawn, Matt, Janice. Thank you so much. We would like to thank, of course, the organizing committee of this initiative, Jack Cohen, Peter Nagy, Thomas Elliott, Shasta Shadrurin, Giles Palmer, Marianne Saitaves, and of course there is lots of work going on behind the scenes in order to make this fantastic series possible and run smoothly. So thank you so much for the time that you spend on this. And also you probably have noticed, because you must have typed some of the questions, there is really a lot of work behind the scene in preparing and arranging all the questions for the speakers, and this is done by a special team. And today's team member were Marianne Savate, Giles Palmer, Anna McLaughlin, Jack Cohen, and Peter Nagy. So thank you so much. And of course, special thanks to GasSafe Consultant that are giving away these 3 training courses that you guys just won. Let's just repeat the codes for the courses. They will be sent in the next 7 days, just as did the attendance certificate of everyone that were here in the audience. And the session and all the presentation, they will be available soon on the new website. So you can go back and listen again to today's presentation and also any other session. And before we close, just a reminder, next week there will be a very interesting session. The title is Transfolk. What every clinics need to know is same time as today, next Tuesday, the 2nd of February. And with this, I think we are ready to say goodbye and good night in my case. And thank you for being here, and we see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.